All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a pretty mind-bending paradox. How could the absolute most noble, defining human virtue theoretically hold the power to destroy an entire civilization? We're going to explore the architecture of an idea that completely turns our conventional understanding of human compassion upside down.
You've definitely heard the old saying, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Well, we're using that as our anchor today because it perfectly sets the stage for the central argument of the source material we're looking at. The core premise here is that good intentions, when they get totally decoupled from reason, can actually yield catastrophic results.
And that brings us to the actual catalyst for today's explainer, a book called Suicidal Empathy by evolutionary behavioral scientist Gad Saad. He puts forward a seriously provocative thesis. He suggests that Western society is suffering from a collective psychiatric diagnosis. Basically, he argues that our emotional systems have become severely dysregulated, leading to what he terms suicidal empathy. Let's map out exactly how he builds this case.
Here is our roadmap for the breakdown. 1. The roots of empathy. 2. The empathy sweet spot. 3. The dark side of empathy. 4. Defining suicidal empathy. 5. A civilizational contagion. And finally, 6. The suicide of society.
All right, Section 1. The roots of empathy.
So Saad's baseline premise here is that empathy isn't just some cultural invention. It is deeply evolutionarily hardwired into us. Because humans are such a profoundly social species, empathy is literally essential for our survival and social bonding. Just think about your own life for a second. This biological mechanism dictates almost everything we value. It influences the traits we look for in a romantic partner, the success of doctor-patient relationships, even how we form cross-sex friendships.
To give you an idea of just how deeply biological this actually is, think about contagious yawning. Research shows that a person's level of empathy directly correlates with how often they catch a yawn. It's considered a physiological demonstration of empathetic mirroring. And incredibly, this whole phenomenon has even been documented between humans and dogs. It just goes to show how wired this social trait is across mammalian species.
Moving on to Section 2. The empathy sweet spot.
This brings us to what's known as the inverted U-curve. Saad borrows heavily from Aristotle's whole everything in moderation concept here. The idea is that human flourishing happens at a middle sweet spot. Our emotional systems are carefully calibrated to this. If you have too little of a trait, sure, it's harmful. But crucially, if you have way too much of it, it can be equally destructive. An excess or a deficit of empathy inevitably leads to dysfunction.
Building on that idea, the author outlines 4 very specific ways this emotional module can actually misfire. See, humans have cognitive empathy, which is understanding someone else's pain, and emotional empathy, actually feeling it. Because we have both, things can easily go awry. You could have high cognitive but low emotional empathy, low cognitive but high emotional empathy. Both could be totally absent, or both could be completely in overdrive. Whenever these fall outside of Aristotle's optimal sweet spot, our natural systems just get hijacked.
Which leads us to Section 3, the dark side of empathy.
Let's look at the 2 extreme ends of this dysfunction. On one far side, you've got psychopaths. They lack emotional empathy entirely, but they possess enough cognitive empathy to weaponize it. They fake remorse or understanding just to exploit others. On the complete opposite end of the spectrum, you have super helpers. These are incredibly well-meaning folks who suffer from hyperempathy. Because their compassion gauge is essentially stuck on overdrive, they frequently suffer from massive emotional burnout and compassion fatigue.
And this creates a really dangerous vulnerability, because our own empathy can absolutely be manipulated. The book uses some pretty chilling examples to show how predators rely on their victims hitting that sweet spot of empathy. Think of serial killer Ted Bundy faking an injury to get women to help him, or that famous terrifying ruse by Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. They don't kill with kindness. They kill through kindness. They use our most noble instinct, the drive to help the vulnerable, as a literal trap for the unsuspecting.
All right, Section 4, defining suicidal empathy.
Now we hit the absolute core thesis of our explainer today, suicidal empathy. Saad argues that Western civilization is essentially suffering from a collective psychiatric diagnosis. In his framework, the political class and the intelligentsia are infected by this emotional dysregulation. He claims it causes them to champion progressive political policies based entirely on how compassionate those policies feel, completely decoupled from the actual, often very negative, real-world consequences.
So how does this actually play out in the real world? Well, the author draws on Thomas Sowell's concept of the vision of the anointed to explain three key mechanisms: luxury beliefs, moral licensing, and performative allyship. The argument goes that societal elites push for these empathy-driven policies, things like open borders or relaxed justice systems, mostly as a way to feel virtuous. It's considered a luxury belief because, well, they're often insulated in gated communities away from the fallout. They're paying a sort of emotional indulgence to preen their own morality while entirely avoiding the societal costs.
Let's move to Section 5, a civilizational contagion.
Here, the book outlines what it calls a series of misguided empathetic inequalities. Saad posits that this suicidal empathy basically creates a completely inverted hierarchy where the wrong things end up being prioritized. He argues that under this framework, policies elevate the feelings of marginalized groups over objective truth, or they end up showing more infinite kindness to criminals than to the actual victims, effectively viewing the felons as the true victims of a corrupt society.
To describe exactly how this spreads, the author uses a really striking medical metaphor. He literally compares suicidal empathy to a fast-spreading societal contagion or destructive pathogen, like a flesh-eating bacteria consuming a culture. Drawing on network science that tracks how behaviors spread, he argues this dysregulated empathy acts like epidemic hysteria. It just rapidly infects the social network of an entire society.
Finally, Section 6, the suicide of society.
If we look back historically, going completely against our basic survival instinct through suicide has manifested in a bunch of different ways. We're talking everything from ancient honor cultures, like the mass suicide at Masada or the practice of seppuku, all the way to the collective group suicides we've seen in modern cults like Johnstown and Heaven's Gate. Saad brings these up to show that collective self-destruction is a recognized, albeit extreme, human phenomenon.
This whole dynamic leads to a pretty powerful warning from the British historian Arnold J. Toynbee. He famously said, "Civilizations die from suicide, not by murder." Saad uses this maxim to really hammer home his overarching argument. He frames suicidal empathy as exactly this type of self-inflicted internal failure. It's not some external enemy that brings down the society, rather it's the internal decay caused by the complete misfiring of its own most noble virtue that precedes the ultimate collapse.
And that brings us to a final, really provocative question to think about. Do our greatest virtues actually hold the potential to become our greatest civilizational threats? Whether you agree with Gad Saad's specific political applications or not, his theoretical framework forces us to deeply examine the limits of human emotion. It asks us to seriously consider what happens when a society's compassion operates totally without the boundary of reason. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the ideas that shape our world.